Good evening. Welcome to Critical Witness, where we talk about anything and everything around Christianity, philosophy, culture, and wherever else our conversations take us. I'm Phil. I've got Dan, co-host, and our guest, Graham. I'll put you guys on the screen. Welcome, Graham, to our show, our professional show, where we're always ready for the show to start on time. And we're learning still. So
it was a great little intro bit of music, and then it all went quiet, and then there you were.
There I was, and I wasn't as surprised as I often am for some reason.
Yeah, you used to look surprised, sort of like this. Is like, oh, it's
hello.
He's getting better after about 35 goes.
41, but who's counting? So, Graham, tell us a bit about yourself. You know Dan somehow. Dan's got you on the show. I'm learning with the audience. So in 5 minutes or less, who are you and what's important to you? And we'll get to why you're on the show in a bit.
Yeah. I actually don't know Dan. I actually have no clue why I'm on, but it's a great pleasure to be on. But I don't know you, Dan. I haven't got that wrong. I haven't sort of like met you.
Well, I wouldn't. I think no is too far. We visited your church about a month ago. You moved to Haywards Heath. So we briefly chatted. I spoke longer with your wife, and she was very nice during the summer. So yeah, we don't technically know each other, but we have met.
I didn't make that connection at all. So the audience is learning with me who you are.
We're all learning.
How I even knew you. You could have said that in the email, and then it might have made sense. I thought my amazing social media and like general YouTube presence had just like reached you because I'm like so famous, but clearly not. So, that's an epic fail. Okay,
go on, Dan. Nice.
No, I mean.
You should join our church, by the way, and then I'd get to know you.
Yeah,
there you go.
Cool. All right, I'll get back to me because obviously it's about me more than about
It is about you. So which church is that?
Christ Church Haywards Heath.
Cool.
Where I'm basically I'm a guy who's a pastor of that church. One of the pastors. We've got a couple of full-timers and some other staff, and I do that sort of majority of my time. And then in some other of my time, I'm director of an organization called Affinity, which is kind of a network of networks. So it's like a super group of church networks. And we kind of get together. We try and encourage one another with what's going on right across the British Isles into Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales with different networks, some Presbyterian, some FIEC type kind of independent evangelical, Grace Baptists, some Anglicans and stuff. So we get together, encourage one another, pray about various situations. We have a theological conference every couple of years where we have original papers sort of being presented and on a theme. We produce a theological journal called Foundations, and we also try and engage with the Christian media and with the secular media, try and be a voice for conservative evangelical Christians. And that's mainly what I do. So although I do all the other stuff, it kind of happens naturally, all the other stuff. My main attention in the sort of day or so a week I've got is in writing and trying to get media appearances and talk about anything really from a Christian perspective. The sort of mainstay is Christian media, but every couple of weeks I get on Talk Radio or GB News or BBC Local or something like that. Sometimes BBC National, but that's a bit rarer.
Yeah. So you were on GB News recently, so maybe we'll get onto that a little bit. I guess the natural question then, it sounds like you're quite broad in your reach, but what do you find in the conversations are most commonly at the moment?
In churches, you mean, or with non-Christians?
Maybe a little. Let's start with churches. What are you kind of finding you need to tackle as conversations within church, and we'll move to more secular in a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that there's all the standard stuff going on in churches that's always going on with, how do we do evangelism and how do we disciple, and there's all those things which are always an issue. I guess the two standout things that have become more prominent in the last couple of years, one is COVID, not surprisingly, So there's just lots of conversations going on in churches that have been going on ever since COVID started, really. But the kind of, how do we recover? How do we restart? What does it look like? How do we reconnect with people we might have just lost a bit of connection with? How do we deal with people who are completely gung-ho compared to people who are still frightened to leave the house? And I think virtually all churches are facing that. You kind of think you're unique, but pretty much all churches have a core in the middle that are pretty chilled. You have a small group who are like, why didn't we start meeting, the day after COVID broke out? And then you've got another sort of core who are, we're too scared and you really shouldn't be breathing, sort of thing. And trying to promote Christian unity in churches and between churches with that going on, that's an issue. I think the other thing that is around is, that's kind of slightly been provoked by that, is, but just kind of, what is the church? What's the point of the church? And connected with that, sort of, how do we lead the church? What's a healthy church culture, I suppose, is a way of putting it. And that's partly emerging out of COVID as to, people have been asking questions they never asked before, like, does it matter if we physically meet? Does it matter if you have the Lord's Supper physically together, or is it okay to all just practice it all at home? Is being bodily present a thing? But more than that, like, is it just about consuming? Like, is church just about, we just kind of download some information from the preacher or the Bible teacher or the person who's given a report, and that's what we do, and we just happen to do it in the room with a few other people, or or is it more than that? And then stuff about leadership culture, which is sort of bleeding through from some mostly good stuff about bullying leadership and leadership in organizations, in the workplace, in the home, that is kind of bleeding through in a good way to churches, asking questions about our leaders. Are people like me bullies? What kind of leaders are we? So that's a conversation that's going on right across churches. So there's just a couple of things, along with all the normal stuff.
So how exactly did you navigate in terms of leading the church? How did you navigate COVID? And would you, if you got in respect to what you did, would you do anything differently on reflection?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we behaved perfectly, but I don't think there's anything fundamentally we do differently. I think in the end, we recognised in the church and in the leadership there was a range of views. Some of us were kind of almost on the point of this is overreach by the state, and some were a bit more, we really need to love each other by being a bit more cautious than the state is. And the way we navigated that at our church was we went with the rules. So whatever a fair interpretation of the law and the guidance was at any point, we went with that, because that's consistent. It was defensible. You could explain it to anybody. So when we weren't allowed to open for a month, or for the few months at the very beginning, we didn't open. As soon as we were allowed to open, the first Sunday, well, it was the second Sunday, but we got completely open. We did exactly what we were allowed to do. As soon as we were allowed to not wear masks and sing, we didn't wear masks and we sung. As soon as we were allowed to not socially distance, we didn't socially distance anymore. So that's kind of the way we've navigated it. And then that's in terms of the decisions. And then in terms of the communication of it, we just tried to explain it. So for the very first opening, we had a sort of Zoom church meeting-y thing where we tried to explain to people what we were doing. We tried to set out why we're meeting, why it's important, why we're taking risks. We did a questionnaire a couple of times, like, what you're worried about, what's your biggest concerns. The church is about 170 members, so it's a reasonable number. It's not massive, but it's it's a reasonable number to sort of make sure you know what everyone's thinking. So yeah, as much dialogue as we could. Probably the things that weren't perfect were, whether we dialogued quite enough, whether we took into account everyone's views, whether sometimes, one of us might make a slightly offhand joke or remark, which kind of labelled somebody as something, you know what I mean? So they're probably the little wrinkles that we did along the way, where, I might have said, "Oh, I'm fed up with wearing masks," and that was a true expression of how I felt on the day. But there are some people who would see that as a signal that you're kind of promoting a rebellion or something. And because I have this role in Affinity, I was also writing to the government at various times saying, you should allow us to sing, this is ridiculous, or you should allow us to start meeting again, or you know, mask wearing is a bit dubious. You know, do we really need to do it in church? When we're seeing loads of football crowds watching the Euros and so forth. And so that gave me a sort of, it gave me a bit of an edge sometimes, that people thought I was a total rebel. So navigating that was a little bit tricky.
Yeah.
So it's all good learning.
Yeah, it's some interesting things. I think the dialogue was an important one, because part of the decisions we had as a church in Guildford, we meet in a school, and the school wasn't opening for outside rentals, so they took much of the decision making out of our hands.
Yeah.
So in that regard, it was actually quite straightforward. No one saw us as kowtowing to the state. They just saw it as a practical, this is what we have to live with, and how do we then meet online. But in terms of explaining the sort of rationale around meeting online and sort of communion stuff, I think we just rolled with it, because that's all we could do, and sort of life groups. But in terms of really navigating the theology of what it means to be bodily present, and do we need that for communion, I think we might have just skipped over those a little bit and just kind of went for it. It seemed to work. We haven't lost too many people, thank the Lord, and our church has actually grown on the other side of COVID. But it's that kind of dialogue is something I think we could definitely do a bit better. And just sort of recognizing how much to push back on some of the regulations was quite interesting, seeing how we could navigate that with. Were you part of the, because we talked to Ian Paul, I don't know if you know Ian Paul, but we talked to him, and he was on Sky News, I think, defending the several hundred, if not 1,000 pastors or church leaders that are signed to keep churches open in a second lockdown. Were you part of that? Was that something that Affinity did as well, or was that?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I was one of the signatories of that. I can't remember. There was a number of letters, but I think I was signatory to that. There was another letter that was to do with vaccination passports, which I kind of agreed with in principle, but I didn't sign that one in the end for various reasons. But yeah, I did sign the church opening one. There were kind of mainly people in our network from the International Presbyterian Church and various others who were kind of at the centre of that, and people like Dave Gobbett and various other people who were sort of our part of our little network of mates in Affinity. So yeah, I can't remember what the question was now, but I was
it's just interesting. Were you part of that? Something that came out of that, though, just out of the sort of controversial point that is actually fairly prominent in maybe is the vaccination passport. So I guess I'd just be interested to, because it's something that I'm aware of. I think I'm against it in the church, but I haven't really articulated my thoughts or really processed them. So I'd just be interested. Have you thought through this, if you've signed or not signed? I think I didn't sign just because some of the language in the letter, it wasn't the principle. I think the principle is rotten of vaccine passports. I think this is not the main point, but I think they're sort of biologically, epidemiologically a bit dubious anyway, because the main value of the vaccine is not so much stopping transmission. So I think they're dubious in that sense. But I think from a Christian and church leader point of view, I think they're discriminatory. They kind of they run counter to what we as churches would want to be, which is places that are open to people. And there are people who, for economic or just communication reasons, haven't been vaccinated. You know, they're just not in the same kind of, you know, media bubble that everyone else is in. There are people who, for principled reasons to do with the fact that it's from a kind of fetal line, who have not been vaccinated. And I just wouldn't feel in good conscience that I would want to exclude them on that basis. Particularly the ones who in good conscience have not done it. And I wouldn't want to be standing at the door. I mean, it's bad enough kind of asking people if they got symptoms on the way in, but asking them to give kind of proof of vaccination just seems counter to kind of the gospel. And I think with COVID, we basically moved to from a time of
the prudent thing was to kind of take the medical advice, and trusting God meant that we kept the rules. I think we're now in a state where we say we're going to keep the rules, but we're going to trust God as well. So we'll take the reasonable amount of risks in life that we would normally. And we can't just we can't get into a mentality where you just reduce risk to zero.
Yeah. I think that was something that was definitely said by Paul on the interview he did with Sky. It was just the need for faith in the face of death.
Yeah.
But also the recognition that we as Christians have something to offer society in that arena where death is sort of surrounding us, but also that we can't remove that risk totally, and our society seems to be so risk averse. And just if you've got a comment on that, feel free. But I was just going to clarify a little bit. I think with the vaccine passports, just to maybe push back, is there any sort of form of check that you would be satisfied with? So if it was like vaccine or lateral flow test, or do a lateral flow test in front of us, and is there any sort of middle ground between absolute not, it's against the gospel, yeah, we'll do a few checks because there might be a risk? I'll just be interested in your thoughts, and yours, Dan, because we haven't talked about this either, Dan. So
why don't you
Graham,
go first, Dan? Go first, Dan, if you want.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I think as Graham's already said, there's so much confusion out there. Like, I still speak to people like friends and family and sort of about this sort of the misunderstandings about the purposes of vaccinations, how different vaccines are different. Like the whole modus operandi of certain vaccines is different. Some stop you getting the disease, and so the idea of reaching sort of herd immunity is the fact that upon reaching that threshold, it's very difficult to pass on the disease. The challenge, which we know now with the COVID vaccine, is that it doesn't necessarily stop the spread of infection, but it stops the severity. It reduces the severity of those symptoms and the likelihood that someone's going to be hospitalized, and reduces mortality. Basically, it reduces morbidity and mortality rates in those who are at highest risk. So, and that's very different. I think when you're dealing with a disease with much higher mortality rates, and that's not to diminish the deaths and harm that's been done by COVID, but I think now we have a bigger picture. We have a lot more data. We have a lot more to go on. I think the case for making vaccines mandatory is weakened by that. If you're dealing with something like Ebola or we talk about very serious high mortality rates, and you've got something spread like that. Well, of course, there's a much stronger case to be made. I'm not saying I know exactly where that threshold would be, but I don't think what we know now that the ethical case and the medical case for justifying mandatory vaccines is particularly warranted. So it's not something I would support as an ethicist at all. I don't think there's a very strong case to be made for it.
What you argue is interesting, though, is because it kind of illustrates the problem that church leaders have had, which is there's some theology to do with church and state, to do with how ready are we to take risks, do we trust God, to do with our fear of death. So there's loads of interesting theological things, but we've also had to try and become semi-experts in epidemiology and risk management as well, which are not always our core skills. So it's been quite kind of testing, and some of the decisions we've had to make are a sort of combination it's difficult to unravel which is the most important. There's a theological point and there's a risk management point. So if you were totally unconvinced by the biology or the medical case, would you rebel? That's interesting. So that means your decision is based on more than theology. It's based on theology plus your assessment of whether what the government is asking you to do is reasonable. And what's been interesting in debates we've had in Affinity, we did a little mini conference on it. We met recently in person in September, and as a sort of network of leaders, and gave papers on what we learned from COVID. And what's interesting is trying to test the limits of how overreached would the government need to be for you to actually say the government says we can't meet, but we're going to meet anyway. Everyone's kind of clear if people say you can't preach the gospel, you can't say Jesus Christ is the Son of God. We'd all say we should meet. We might try and be clever about how we meet and not invite getting arrested, but we'd all want to meet, wouldn't we? But when it comes to the kind of medical ethical questions, we're having to kind of wrestle. Yeah, quite how bad is this, and how unloving am I if we meet anyway, and how reckless am I being? So I think it's really hard.
It is hard. It is, and the problem is there's a fog at the beginning with any pandemic. There is a fog of and the fear we went through, and we're looking at what's going on in China initially, and that we were driven by fear. And I think we did the right thing initially. I absolutely agree. I think caution is warranted in the face of that sort of fog, and it's taken 18 months to 12 to 18 months to really figure out what's going on, try and figure out and how we're going to move forward, and how we're going to respond now, knowing what we know, whilst as Christians still trying to love our neighbours, still trying to still want to be in a position where we share the gospel, open churches, people can go to work, etc. It's really challenging. I like how you said about church leaders had to become epidemiologists and things like that. Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of the I'll be brutally honest, I think some church leaders have been absolutely reckless, and in becoming epidemiologists, they've become terrible epidemiologists, and they don't know what they're talking about. In terms of vaccines, especially, has been a frustration. I think a lot of, for about 12 months, all I did was talk about vaccines and try and I have a sort of medical background, and try and deal. And it became tiring listening to Christians and Christian leaders and people I respect just talk nonsense and promoting it as truth, and lacking humility. Like I'll be on a thread, I'm not being nasty. Like I've read Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind, and obviously the Gospels as well. Driven. You don't persuade people. You very rarely do you persuade people by coming across as a dick, basically. and it doesn't matter whether what you're saying is true. If you come across if you come across as mean, and people are not going to be persuaded. So I tried my best just to say, look, this is the fact. What you're saying is not necessarily true. Here's why, A, B, C, D. And people would just laugh emoji, block you. And these are, priests, pastors, and it was really shameful, and it was upsetting. Just thinking, but you've just lied to all these people. You're saying this is tangibly untrue, and you're spreading this to the hundreds of people in your congregation. And I found that one of the most upsetting and frustrating things as people. That expertise problem. Yeah, you're expert. You might be a theologian, but it doesn't mean that you're not an epidemiologist or anything else. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, but I still think those questions are hanging to do with how far would the government have to go? How much are we now driven by fear? Have we become too risk averse? So I could still keep all the rules and accept the case, as you said, for being conservative, particularly in the early stages. I can accept all that, but still I have a worry about whether I have become, and that we have become, slightly too much driven by fear and the desire to control risk. And the pandemic has kind of exposed that in all of us to some degree. And what it hasn't done, which is really disappointing, is it hasn't provoked a revival. I think a few of us thought, wow, loads of people are going to die. There's going to be millions become Christians because nobody wants to die. But in the way God works it, that hasn't quite happened. It's more that the church has argued with itself for a while. And we've worked out what's wrong with the church rather than what's wrong with the world, probably.
Yeah, and we still disagree about what's wrong with the church. So still, we can't even unite on that front.
I think we could say that if the government said today you can't go to church, we would just ignore that.
I hope so.
I think we would, but even that would be controversial. I mean, I'm a head of this network called Affinity, and within
I didn't think that would be controversial.
I think there were I'm just going through the process. There were people who were, so let alone, you know, in an individual church, in a church network, you got people who wanted to meet even when we weren't allowed to meet in November, you know, for that month when in England, at least you weren't allowed to meet. So there were people who were still meeting in my network, and people who were thinking I'm too on the side of the conservative sort of, you know, don't meet kind of group. And then there were people in the conservative don't meet group who were saying I'm too much on the side of the kind of rebels because, you know, I tried to give both sides a voice in that sort of thing. And I think even now, I reckon if a number of church leaders went to our elders and said, the government have just said, you know, we're going into a harsh winter, we're going to lock down for a month in November. I don't know. I personally would think it's not credible, but I don't know whether churches would just go for it because that's kind of what we got used to and we know how to do it. I don't know. I think that might be a bit more controversial than you think.
I would have. Yeah, I thought it would have been. I mean,
but now you've said it. I think I'd rebel now because you said that we.
But the thought it's your fault. He started.
Well,
it.
I'm absolutely.
Do you mean like don't meet as in don't meet because if it's a lockdown, or just the government's just suddenly said churches can't meet?
I think if they said, look, it's different, isn't it? I think if it's like, I don't know, it's different if they said for 2 weeks. Look, for 2 weeks we're going to do this. But if it's a sort of right, you're not meeting. There's no designated endpoint. I think that becomes problematic for me. I think that would be well, where's the evidence? Like, what is it? What is it about meeting at a church that increases the risk of for people? It's difficult.
Especially when they're following the guidelines.
Especially if you're following the guidelines. Like if you're in church, you can meet, you can wear masks, sanitize your hands. You know, don't come in if you've got symptoms. You know, you be sensible. You know, those that are willing to get vaccinated, be vaccinated. It's difficult to see because at the moment, it's difficult to see how, if you look in 2 years' time, how different will we be right now in 2 years?
Yeah.
Probably not that different. A lot of us hope that'd be different, but the realities are I don't think it'll be that different in 2 years. I don't think it will be that different. And I think
is that because medically you just get to a point where you've got, you know, 90% of people have got antibodies, but it's cycling all the time. It's waning. More people are catching. So you have a core group of people who are always going to be catching and passing on.
Well, and you also need a variant as well. What happens if you suddenly get a new variant? You know, Delta was like twice as twice as communicable as the initial coronavirus. So what happens if you now get something that's
even more
a change in the spike protein? Suddenly, you know, your existing vaccines are not as efficacious. There's so many variables you don't know. So you could be in a worse place in 2 years than you are now. But potentially. I hope we. You know,
how many boosters do we need by then?
and I hope that we're not. But I also think there'll be other treatments as well. There's a lot of a lot of people don't want to be injected with things. Okay, well, Merck's are working on pills, and there's all sorts of different things that people are much more likely to do that will reduce the severity of disease and symptoms and things.
So have you guys got any kind of, I don't know, one, or I'll let you do two big lessons from COVID time? If you kind of span the whole 18 months and say, what I learned during COVID was, you know, how to do online podcasting, or I learned something about myself, or I learned something about church, or I learned nothing at all.
This started in pandemic. So this whole podcast and meet across people across the world. So we've had people like Sam Chan while he's in Australia, and a few people from the States chatting with us. So broadening that network, I think. I think I'm still processing how divided people are over, because it wasn't just pandemic in the last 18 months. It's the race question. Yeah. It seems like the church has become both woke and anti-woke at the same time. Yeah. And there's like very little middle ground, so that even Tim Keller's being called a Marxist. So it's just trying to process that at the speed at which division has hit the church over just the basic of what it means to love your neighbor. And as Dan said, the recognition of there's been quite a few high profile pastors and preachers that I would have tolerated in the past, but now I'm like, I can't even listen to you. You're just, everything's political. And while, there's the gospel is political and does have things to say about politics, it shouldn't be waving a Republican flag, even in the UK. So it's just, I guess that's what I'm processing. I'm not sure I can say what I've learned, because I'm still learning how to navigate that at the moment. So I'm really intrigued by Affinity and what they're doing to bring unity when we have such polarized views, which even sound like hatred within the church. You watch what people are saying about the woke or the anti-woke or the Democrats, and even though we're in England, I'm seeing these conversations going, well, who cares? Who cares if Trump wins or loses? Like, that shouldn't affect us. And then let alone the ones that were before pandemic of like abortion, assisted dying and stuff that were always polarized outside the church, that polarization. So in answer to your question, I'm still not sure. I'm not sure I can nail it down to one thing. I think it's just realizing that maybe that division was in the church in the first place, but it was more tolerated rather than a united aspect.
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it's been amplified by the crisis, but also a lot of it is amplified in social media, and it's a kind of it's a slice. It's not necessarily what's going on across the church more generally. Why it's quite perplexing is that I think some people have lost the ability to reflect on themselves and think about why they're saying what they're saying. So my observation is that, for want of a better word, both left-wing and right-wing views are being expressed with no sense that there's a kind of political judgment aspect to it. And it's not just happening on one side, in my observation. So, so people are thinking a right-wing view is more Christian, and some people are thinking a left-wing view is more Christian. It's not just that, the right wings have gone crazy and are more like, the Republicans in the States, and the left wings are all the sensible ones. It's kind of, it's happening all over the place. And I'll give a little sort of example that I met with someone recently who was saying, well, what are you doing going on GB News? That's a right-wing channel. And I said, well, I'll just go wherever anyone asks me, because it's like a great opportunity. You get a little slice where maybe for 1 minute you can talk about the gospel. So I don't really care where I go. If the Guardian wants to interview me, or BBC, and I'll do all of those. But it was an interesting conversation how they sort of positioned that as kind of being right wing, and that was an issue. And some people on Facebook sometimes say, well, why aren't you talking about refugees more, or why aren't you talking about the £20 change in the universal credit? And I don't have a right wing or a left wing view on the £20 change in the universal credit, but I think that is a very political kind of judgment, a very precise sort of narrowly focused judgment on that. But some people genuinely think the Christian view is that you should be against it, and there's probably some people who think the genuine Christian view is could be for it. My genuine Christian view is I don't have a clue about that. So you can talk about principles of caring for people, and you might debate redistribution of wealth in general, but particular policies and refugee policies are really hard to figure out. What's the right Christian view? You can say we want to welcome the stranger, we want to care for those people who are genuine fleeing persecution. You don't want to encourage trafficking. So you can have all these kind of principal milestones, but that might lead people to slightly different political conclusions from that. And you have to kind of respect that. And I'm always trying to reflect on, is what I'm saying a general Christian principle that everyone will agree on, or have I now moved into a kind of an opinion, which I need to context it as this is just my opinion, I'm not really sure. Anyway, I know we've gone a bit off topic there, but
no. I think that is important in the sense of just thinking about cultural wars and unity, and I think there's a sense of humility that I don't see in many of these conversations, and so I guess maybe that is a point of learning over COVID, is be more humble about what you do and don't know. And I think there's an aspect of being a preacher and a teacher and a pastor where it's best that you sound confident, even if you don't know what you're talking about, and say it confidently and drop in a few Bible verses and you'll be okay, rather than going, actually, I'm still wrestling with this. I'm trying to work out how best to serve the church through this myself. And that's an okay place to be as a pastor, rather than as this guy at the top preaching down, everyone follow me in this direction, even if I don't really know what I'm talking about. That's kind of where I'm at. Dan, how about you on that one?
I mean, I'm trying to think so many things. I think one thing was value of family. I think it really brought that home a bit more, the importance of family and how much my kids missed their family, and how we were, already knew that the family unit should not be an island, but I think it hit home not being able to see people as much as we would have liked.
What age are your kids, Dan?
So they're 2, 4, and 6.
Okay. Yeah. Good.
So that hit them really hard, and seeing really like their mental health. Like, it seems weird, talk about the mental health of a 3-year-old, but my son really was going mad because he couldn't see his grandparents, and once he did, it was fine. It was literally just changed. It was really got him to a dark, as dark as a 3-year-old, the place can get mental. I think it really, really made him sad. He was sad. And they were all sad, and it just made such a difference. I think other things. I think initially in the pandemic, very hopeful about. It felt like even before the pandemic, politically, we were just fractured. We were fractured, and I thought in some hopeful way it would draw us together, and it did for about a month. We're all blowing trumpets and and whistles and shaking things in the front door, and people in politics and different parties are being nice to each other, and then sort of like 2 months later we're all back to being just broken again. It was just amazing how quickly we could so I guess that was a lesson in our flawed, sinful nature, unfortunately. So it was I can think of so many things I learned throughout that I certainly wouldn't want to go through it again. I think friendship as well. I don't really. I don't feel like I need to have be around people all the time. I kind of like being left to myself. But I think during COVID, I really missed just conversation with friends, which is what forced us to do this. I like interesting conversations. Whether that's sort of theology, philosophy, history, whatever sort of going on, I like, and to be deprived of that was I found quite difficult. I think towards the end, especially. So this is why this was quite helpful. It was almost sort of therapeutic, I think, in a way, to get to chat with Phil a bit more and to chat with other people as well. I've enjoyed it, and again, it's not the same as being physically present. Even this is great, but it's not the same as being physically present. But that's something I found quite helpful. So it kind of shone a light to a kind of need that I told myself I didn't really have, but actually I do.
You're not as introverted as you think.
Well, I can revert to type quite quickly.
Yeah. I guess you said you had a conference fairly recently about that very question. Yeah. So do you have a summary of what you guys as a sort of group came to in the conference, like things moving forward, how to move the church forward, what you wouldn't go back to?
We if you look on our website, affinity.org.uk, there's a paper by John Stevens, which was the kind of one of the things. So we basically looked at it, what lessons from the church kind of has there been from COVID, and then kind of what lessons in terms of the kind of country in which we live and so on. So from the sort of church point of view, we thought about kind of what it said about church and state, and we all kind of, I don't know, figured out how to comply, but using our own ecclesiology. So there were quite some fun things, like the Presbyterians, who would have a different view about church and state. They would say, you know, the state could never tell the church what to do, but in this case, we're going to do what the state wants us to do. Whereas the sort of you know, independent evangelicals were a bit more chilled about that kind of relationship. The Anglicans were different again. So I think we all kind of found our way to sort of get there. We were more reflecting, so we went kind of back over, what does it teach us about our ecclesiology? What does it teach us about kind of social media and the escalation of debates on social media? What's it taught us about leadership and how you lead through a crisis, how you lead when not everyone agrees, but it's not theological. So, you know, normally you lead through, like, you know, we're going to do this. We've got this strategy for the church. We're going to do this, and here's the theological basis. And there's a bit of judgment involved, but you know, we as leaders are together, and nearly always the church is with you on it. When there are differences that are not theological, it's just something we've never learned to lead through, really. So we reflected quite a lot on that, chatted through that sort of thing. What else do we think about? The ecclesiology goes on forever. I could. So those sort of things, really. About ecclesiology, leadership, about faith and risk. So kind of things I've hinted at already, but asking us to question, are you lacking in faith if you don't carry on meeting during this kind of thing? And you know, where are the kind of endpoints to that? And do we only trust God when we think it's a reasonable risk? So, you know, I could say when I catch an aeroplane, I'm trusting God, you know, to preserve my life, but I'm actually also making a risk calculation, and I wouldn't trust God if aeroplanes statistically fell out of the sky half the time, would I?
No.
So, but is there any kind of point at which you say, well, I will take a risk because this is more important to me, and where are those points? I think it's like throwing the whole thing up in the air about that. I'm a bit like a bit like you, Phil, in the sense that I'm still processing after this, as I'm just illustrating, because I'm huffing and puffing. I'm still trying to figure out, what do I actually think? I haven't got the answer. I've just got loads of questions. About faith and risk, and if it was clear cut, like, you know, I'm going to walk through the fire in order to tell this person the gospel who won't hear about it any other way. You know, that would seem kind of like very virtuous and noble, but there are lots of kind of micro risks we take, and would we take a bit more for the sake of the gospel, and what would we take? You know, is this got me to a mentality where if I was going to get shot, you know, I wouldn't, because I'd think, well, I don't want to die in this way. This is me being sensible about life. You know, as a good Christian, I'm sort of honouring life, and so I'm not going to get shot, and this person will hear about the gospel some other way.
Out of oh, go on, Phil. You go. You were going to say something.
No, it was more just that interesting comparison of the amount of people that felt like it was a persecution against the church to be closed. And it was just an interesting point of the faith and risk, and I think because there was more nuance to it, and very early on in our channel, we had a good conversation about nuance with Andy Kind, but the lack of it on social media, I think that was amplified as soon as we started getting past the, right, I'm not clapping for NHS, maybe we should give them a pay rise instead of everyone clapping, and that kind of argument. But we don't have any nuance anymore in these conversations. And the moment churches were shut down, you had a bunch of people saying this is persecution. And well, no, there's medical reasons, or at least there was an unknown risk at the time. So it's not persecution. And so it's does the church have a persecution complex? I think was a question that at some point, and maybe it still does in the West. But yeah, that was more my comment. Dan, if you've got a question.
No, I mean, nuance is hard, isn't it? I mean, social media doesn't reward nuance. Nuance is not sexy. Like people want either, clear view on the right, clear view on the left, or a bit of madness. It doesn't want nuance. Nuance is, I think the truth is often found in the nuance. And I think it really reflects the fact that often social media is not interested in truth. It's interested, obviously, in primary, economic motivations. It wants clicks. It wants this. It wants to keep your interest. And nuance is often a little bit boring compared to something that's much, watch so and so smash so leftist university student. Watch so and so destroy right wing. That's the stuff that sells. But anyway, enough of that. I was going to go back, Graham, in terms of did history and tradition play any role in your response in terms of previous church responses to pandemics, in terms of looking back at church responses during Spanish flu, bubonic plague, Calvin, etc., going back to Justinian. I mean, is that something you've looked at, or has that played any part in looking at what Christians have done before us in tradition? I'm a big Protestant, but I think there's so much value in church fathers, and as I'm sure you do, and looking at church tradition and the kind of wisdom of those that have gone before us in things that will, on paper, much scarier. Bubonic plague, Spanish flu, these things had serious high mortality rates.
Yeah, I think the problem with, positively, yes, people cleverer than me recalled very quickly at the beginning of the pandemic, what Luther did and what Calvin did and what various other people did, and Charles Spurgeon at the time of cholera outbreak in South London and so forth. And I think what you found was the lack of nuance in that as well, in that some people kind of used it as an argument for sort of exercising faith and being reckless, and some kind of found little examples that were kind of, yes, but Luther said, you need to be cautious and blah, blah, blah. So people kind of used it in both ways. So I'm not sure it particularly informed. And I think more especially, you can't escape the fact that we have much better knowledge of kind of microbiology than, if that's what it is, than they did. And you can't not have that knowledge. It's a bit like, Charles Spurgeon smoked a cigar or whatever. You can't say, well, you can't ignore the fact that you've got more knowledge now that it gives you lung cancer. So you have to exercise a different degree of caution. And similarly with, now we know a bit more, not a lot, but we know a bit more about how transmission takes place, and we can do testing and all sorts of stuff. You just got to accept that's the world we live in now, where there is knowledge which is shaping my decisions in a different way. When you don't know quite how things transmit and what your risks are, you take a different view. So yeah, I think that's why church history didn't help sort of especially. I mean, just on the persecution front, I don't think our own church or the kind of churches mostly in my kind of network felt persecuted. I think any of them that were nervous were kind of more nervous about precedent than about necessarily kind of what's happening right now. I think the few that were nervous were like, well, this is okay, but what does this mean about if the state now has this lever that it can pull? Might it pull it in the future for different reasons? So just to give them a bit of credit. I think that was more their kind of argument, rather than thinking this is active persecution now.
Interesting.
There were debates about Magna Carta and stuff, weren't there? I don't know if you followed all those, but which I basically didn't understand, but I observed.
But I did hear of some churches meeting on farms and things secretly, and I don't know if they went as far as giving the sign of the fish, but they were definitely like meeting when they shouldn't be. And there
was a bit of that. I mean, there was some that were meeting on a farm and a barn for quite a while, but publishing it on Facebook. So that was and that was when we were allowed to meet, but they were able to be more, sing more and do more,
right?
Because they were meeting out in in a barn and in a field.
Like an illegal raid
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, and there were some clever options that I think could be learnt from, and that those that sort of had, and even at the University of Surrey where I work a decent amount of time, they ended up with one of the biggest outside venues in Europe at one point, because they basically got a huge marquee, and when the walls are up, that's an outside venue, and they just put stacks of outdoor patio heaters in there, and they had table service, and they ended up with a venue where students could actually meet legally in groups of 6 and be socially distant picnic tables. And there's if the church has space for something like that, that could be a creative way of being the church in the same space. And I saw people doing that with outside venues of circles on the ground, and they had enough space to have everyone social distanced. You could do an outside service. So there were creative ways to work within the law while still being the church. Embodied church.
We last Christmas we did a drive-in carol service, which was something we'd never done before, and we've never really needed to do it before, but I never even thought about it. But because you could meet outside and because you could sing outside, so we went to Ardingly Showground. It's kind of agricultural showground thing, and they one of the big car parks. And we set up a stage on one side, and people drove in and they got out their cars, and we did some fun stuff, and we did a whole Christmas presentation and sung loads of carols and had a band and all that stuff. So that was something we never would have done. It cost us a lot of dosh, mind you, but it was really good. It was a phenomenal number of people. I put it on Facebook, and we had like 120 people for 120 cars for each kind of slot, and we thought, we'll do one slot, see how it goes, put it on Facebook, and they like went bam, put another session on for the afternoon, they went again, and so we ended up doing 3, one after the other, contiguous. What the opposite of simultaneous is, we did 3 one after the other. Just repeated the program 3 times, and they all sold out, completely sold out, and we had loads and loads of people that would never normally come to church stuff. Now they weren't that sticky in that I think there was nothing going on. There was no sort of winter wonderland stuff going on anywhere else. In sort of, shops were all a bit muddled and everything else. So it kind of captured a mood at the time. But the number of non-Christians and non-church people who came was phenomenal. People want to do it again this year. I say no, can't afford. It was thousands of pounds, so we couldn't do it again very easily.
That sounds good. Go on, Dan.
No, I was just going to say, just move quickly, just a little bit off COVID, just before we wrap up. I mean, what other things are you kind of dealing with as a pastor? You think sort of going on that Christians should know about, but they don't, kind of things going on?
Yeah.
And what's your? Because it's nice to talk. I know Phil's an elder, but talking to you as I think you've been a pastor for much longer, I'm assuming. In terms of like, what's the role in terms of things going on in culture, but also being a pastor? Like, what's your role? Shouldn't you just be teaching the Bible, or should you? Yeah, how do you? I think one of the issues I have is that in terms of how informed the Christian is, often depends on book authors they're introduced to or podcasts, and actually listen to a 45-minute sermon in terms of everything you're hearing 6.5 days of the week elsewhere. You tend to form a lot of your views based on what outside that space. So if you're hearing a sermon on Jeremiah 2 on Sunday, it's very difficult to actually there's loads of stuff going out there talking about the environment, about free speech, about assisted dying. I don't know anything. The church never tells me about that. And it's not necessarily explicitly in the Bible either, about masculinity. What does it mean to be a man when we're talking about, or what is, what about the stuff of gender or my children? It's very like, it just seems you end up even with some of you accidentally read a good Christian author on something, or you don't. You have a waffly, uninformed, often secular view. So how do you what do pastors do?
Yeah. Well, I think if you try and cover all the bases all the time, you probably just wear yourself out too much. But in general, it was part of the reason why we started our own podcast called Ordinary, which you can also tune into when you finish listening to all the episodes of this podcast. But it was just another way in. So as church leaders, I think primarily we teach the Bible, and in the preaching of the Bible, we try and make connections with people's everyday lives. But in addition to that, we try and disciple people in informal conversations, in kind of seminar streams that we do at our church, for example, where we do more of a kind of seminar style with discussion and so forth. And it was part of the reason we started the Ordinary podcast, to sort of engage with not so much culture in some sort of fancy way, we're not constantly doing reviews of Squid Games or whatever else is going on, but more just the big sort of cultural soup that's around there, and thinking about it. So for example, we might do a topic like assisted dying, or environmentalism, or identity and identity politics, or questions people ask, what to say if people say something about identity or about Christians are homophobic. What do you think about hell? What do you think about creation, evolution? So those kind of questions in specifics. But I think, I'm not sure I do it very well all the time, or Mark and other people who preach in our church, but we sort of try, and as well as doing a topic in detail, try and sort of make the connection and think about people's everyday lives. But you can't sort of overdo it, because people don't have to be sort of cultural experts to kind of figure out, I love Jesus. Jesus is important to me. I understand the truth that's in Jesus, and I kind of understand the lies that are around me, and God helping me, I'll try and sort of connect all those things up. So you do try and equip, but I think you can't underestimate people's ability to, if they're spirit-filled, eager to learn and grow, that they figure out ways. And sometimes you kind of set the bar high and say, oh, okay, I have to have an amazing, brilliant answer to do with homosexuality, or to do with environmentalism, or understanding the theology and the worldview of people who watch zombie movies or something, and I need to kind of have done a thesis on it before I can even talk about it. A lot of things are are kind of simpler than you think, and generally speaking, the people who are really engaging with God, who are reading their Bibles, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but kind of reading the Bibles, praying, thinking about it, chatting about it with other people, that they kind of it helps you spot. You don't always need some brilliant cultural expert to sort of synthesize and deconstruct something. You kind of figure out, this is right, this is wrong, I can see where this is coming from, and sometimes those books help us, but yeah, anyway, so I got a bit carried away with that, really. I do enjoy the books as well, but don't underestimate the ability of a spirit-filled Christian to kind of figure out a way through. I don't think the issue is that we're not culturally engaged or culturally educated enough. The problem with my heart, and I think sometimes people around me, is we don't love God, we don't trust God, we don't meditate, and we don't engage with God and His Word enough, and we don't pray enough. Those are the sort of things. I don't want to become legalistic about it and say we're all failures. That there is God's grace, but you know what I mean. It's not. It's not. I need to pick another book. I mean, I love books. There's a great book called Plugged In that's just behind me there, that Dan Strange wrote, and Making Christianity Magnetic, another book he's wrote, which talks about cultural connection points. And I'm reading Dreher's book on basically sort of cultural Marxism, Live Not by Lies. That's it. Which is really interesting. Anyway, lots of books, and they do kind of help, but people think because I do a bit of media stuff that I'm really sort of clever on all this cultural stuff, and I just don't think so. I try and not prepare for any interviews, because I think it should just come naturally.
That's really interesting. I think Ian Paul talked a bit about media, and I think he would say the opposite. Like, try and prepare. That's really interesting. I think that shows the difference of working and being able to think on your feet, maybe, and the confidence in that.
Possibly, yeah.
I think one of the things that I've sort of underlined, and I'd just be interested to get your thoughts, Graham, on that, as it's something that I'm trying to work out if it's actually as big a problem as I think it is, and it's come up in some polls that we've done, that there's a common conception that Christians in the church generally don't know how to access the Bible, or and I think what I've underlined is there's truth in nuance, and that kind of pinged into my mind. There's a sort of a way that a Christian should read the Bible is a wrestling with the text in its context, looking at sort of really digging in beyond just here's a verse, this is what it means. And so I've found that finding in that tension, that I can understand what people mean by when they say they love Scripture now, in that there's something to wrestle with, to meditate on, to just chew on beyond the 30-45 minute sermon, but really that it impact what you're thinking, and seeing how the Bible works together, and sort of what used to be kind of nerdy is actually now changing how I view God and theology, and it all sorts of works together. So I guess a big thing as an elder for me at the moment is trying to get people both to understand the good news and why we call it good news, not just it's something you need to know to get to heaven, but also like how to fall in love with the whole Bible, not just the bits with Jesus in them, and why the Old Testament gives us such a foundation. I'll just be interested in your thoughts as a pastor as well. Just do you think that's the case for those who are struggling to walk the cultural waters? Do you see, even anecdotally, a connection between a lack of how to grasp and read the Bible with how they're doing with what's going around them? Or is that just, it depends on the person?
Yeah, I suppose why I'm hesitating slightly is because I'm totally with you and you know, I'm schooled in the whole idea of studying a text in its context and seeing the kind of big picture and how it fits in the whole Bible, how it fits in the particular place, particular verse, people it's written to, all that stuff. You know, what do the words mean, and all those things. So I'm really into that, and I do think that's the richness of the Bible, and the Bible is this kind of this mine that just goes on forever, where you're always learning more stuff, and that's the genius of it. So I'm with you in agreeing that, you know, not everyone's kind of always doing that. I'm just hesitant about setting the bar too high for everyday Christians, and I think it's not so much falling in love with the Bible; it's falling in love. I know this is going to sound cheesy, but, you know, falling in love with God, falling in love with Christ, and you know, God will help you as you do that. I suppose one of the wrestles I'm having at the moment is that the church is generally, and this is not new to me, this is loads of other people are talking about it much more eloquently, but our struggle in reaching people who are not professionally, academically trained. So we have some in the area we are, you know, as a church, and we've reached out. That's mainly been through kind of relationships, and I'm always questioning: is there something in our methodology of the way we preach and the way we talk about the Bible that has a more of an academic focus than Jesus would want us to? Because it's the style of an English literature process of, you know, what's the and I'm totally bought into that's, you know, the Bible was written with words that we could kind of unpick and take every word as a gem and figure out how they all fit together and what they communicate. So I'm into that, and God's equipped preachers in order to do that. But I also want people who are, you know, electricians and joiners, or who haven't got a job at all, or who are single mums, to feel like I can just read it and God will help me understand it. Not in a simplistic way, but you're actually getting me talking about stuff that I'm not even thinking about. So I don't know whether I'm taking you off on on other sort of.
This is what happens on our channel. We say we're talking about unity and culture wars, and we go off to how to read the Bible. So this is just welcome to Critical Witness. This is what we do.
Yeah, and I felt with Dan, I'm not sure, because I went on a little rant about something. I'm not sure I answered his question entirely, but I do think we are trying to, although I've said all the qualifications and nuance, I still think we are, as church leaders, trying to equip people for some of the big cultural markers. So you do want to do that. And I think our job as church leaders is it's the idea of kind of the savage wolves, protecting from savage wolves. It's okay to do more than preach the gospel, in the sense of, the invitation and the implications for life and everything else. It's all right sometimes to warn people about what's out there, and what's out there might be just bad teaching in the church, but what's out there is also bad teaching in the world, for want of a better word. So I do think that's part of my job as well. So I didn't think I answered you adequately there, Dan.
No, I did. I mean, I think that's part of why I wanted to have you on. I think looking at the podcast and stuff I've heard you talking about is, I think you're certainly doing more than most people, I think, seem to do, in terms of at least I've come across in immediate vicinity, in terms of using the podcast to try and address certain things, culture that are going on, or topics that the Christians should have an informed view about. I think it's more of a frustration. I think I've found is that there are certain ideas culturally that, if embraced, do let the foxes into the hen house and start to undermine certain sort of key theological concepts. And
give me an example of that, just to help me.
Okay, so let's think about. I would say about 75% of the Christians I speak to don't have. This is going to be the best one. I'm just trying to think about abortion. Are either loosely pro-choice, or don't really, in terms of their assumptions about unborn human beings, are predicated on things that they've heard culturally, and not that they've it's not based on a richer understanding of the Imago Dei and what it means to be made in the image of God. All humans are made in the image of God. So that would be this is the first thing, because that's what I talk about a lot, is abortion and early life ethics and things. So that would be something where I think a lot of Christians' views have been shaped much more broadly by cultural assumptions than an actual Christian anthropology and understanding of what the human person is. And that sounds. It doesn't need to be in those sort of lofty terms, but actually Christian anthropology is really important. If you have a wrong anthropology, you end up going wrong all over the place. And I would say that's tied into all sorts of other things that are both rich and important. But I'm sure there's so many other things I can think about. When we're talking about assisted dying, we could talk about. I think is another one. I think ideas of what it means to be a man and a woman, I think can be fundamentally undermining. I think all to varying degrees. What does it mean to be a leader? Who can lead?
Leadership's a massive one. I think that is a big one.
Leadership in like masculinity, femininity, all these kinds of things that we don't. I'd say, I don't know, a lot of people I speak to, there's just often very little difference sometimes between the generic sort of Christian view and what everyone else thinks. And to me, that's sad. It's deeply, deeply sad and frustrating, because I think often the Christian view is rich and informed and satisfying. And I don't think we compete very well in the sort of marketplace of ideas, or even in the church.
Yeah. I think what you sometimes get, which might be a similar thing, is that people may, in a conservative church, know that abortion is wrong, or homosexuality is wrong, or changing your gender is wrong, but you need to know more than that. You need to know why, but you also need to know some of the kind of heart issues, and even some of the good things about identity that are being kind of identified in some of those struggles that people go through. Otherwise, what you'll end up with is maybe the older generation who say, no, we shouldn't do that, but we're not quite sure why, but we just know it's bad. And then, you know, the next generation will just reject it because they don't even know why they weren't doing it. And, you know, the cultural pressures are so strong. So I think you've got to kind of got to get underneath and ask the why questions, particularly in the, you know, with the cultural pressures there. I don't know whether this is true because I'm not one. I'm a baby boomer, so that's my age. But I mean, are you guys millennials, or are you a little bit older than millennials?
I think I'm on the edge of millennial, so Dan's definitely.
I'm in my mid-30s, so wherever that puts me. I think I'm technically. I think am I a millennial?
You mid-30s or late 30s now, Dan? Are you telling fibs?
No, I'm technically in the cusp of mid-30s. I think
you might be Generation X. I can't remember quite when it flips over, but I'm
90% sure I'm a millennial.
Okay, well, you were a little bit hesitant when you started. Okay,
no, it's because when you said Gen X, I didn't want to be one of those.
No.
I've just self-identified as a millennial.
Yeah.
Do you think I could do that as well?
Well, people are doing all sorts of things these days.
My observation is that millennials tend to be, as millennials are categorized as being, and that's true in the church as well. I mean, obviously, generalizations are ridiculous, but I think it's not even that complicated, really. It's just the culture I grew up in, although it was not Christian, was just different, you know, and the culture kind of you guys that grew up in, and the general, you know, the current general cultural current has just been different for you. So for my kids who are all millennials, I think they're you know, they've had to work much harder to kind of work through issues that were more just cultural assumptions that I had. You know, so roughly speaking, no one was interested in Christianity. They probably thought it was a good thing in my generation when I was a kid. You know, they might have thought it was wrong or something, but they didn't really think it was bad. And you know, for the sort of millennial generation, it's been a bit more tending towards Christianity is actually fundamentally bad, or some forms of Christianity are fundamentally bad. So it's not like it's good, but I'm not interested. It's like it's bad, and I'm actually a bit interested because I think it's really bad. And then all the things that happen with iGeners and so forth. So this does connect with your point, Dan. I think those cultural influences are different for different generations.
Yeah,
and you have to be kind of aware of that, and not try and address the older members of the congregation as though they're millennials or they're Generation Z, and be, you know, super cool with them, but also, you know, similarly not understand what the different generations are kind of sampling and what things are influencing them. You know, I didn't get very far, but one of the things I did during lockdown was, you know, we have a pretty big 14 to 18 group, so you know, I like to get them together and just say, you know, what are you guys watching and what you're listening to and what your friends talking about, and you know, what's the biggest thing. And you know, some of those guys who are Christians, the watching wasn't so interesting in that I kind of roughly knew what they were watching, so I didn't learn anything much. You know, what they're listening to, you can kind of figure out. What was really interesting was most of those guys are scared to admit they're Christians because of the view in their school from both teachers and pupils that Christians are bad because they're intolerant about sexuality. You know, that's like the common message. You know, I'm meeting with two guys at the moment who are in secondary school, and you know, they're pretty much convinced about that the gospel is true and they want to be Christians, but they kind of push the pause button because they don't fancy coming out as a Christian in school because it's just too hard for them. And you kind of need to be aware that, you know, obviously you got to push them and try and equip them to have answers, but also to say, you know, you just got to be brave, you know, because that's what following Christ is like for you guys.
And I can sympathise with that. I didn't become a Christian until I was 20. So, you know, school's hard enough without having, you know, being, you know, all the other things going on, you know, and then being automatically assumed to be an evil, intolerant person is not particularly tempting.
Yeah.
It's not good for making friends
in many ways.
For my generation, I mean, I had a Christian upbringing, but I was a bit afraid to say I was a Christian, but not because I thought everyone would think I was bad. I was too image conscious, so I thought people wouldn't think I was cool anymore. Which is a different pressure. It's not quite so intense, and better people than me overcome it more easily. But when you actually think both teachers and pupils are going to think I'm bad, I'm some kind of fundamentalist, nuthead, it's just harder. So yeah. Anyway, that's an example of cultural influence.
It's almost like, because I think the way it is now, it's not even that it's like you're saying I don't matter.
Yes,
you're saying you believe something, and you're saying that I shouldn't exist or I don't matter. And it's very difficult, because those things, it's so deeply ingrained and embraced in terms of it's fundamentally who they see themselves as. It's you can't have it. Almost takes rational dialogue off the table. Like, there's nothing you can. It's very difficult to reason with someone who has a visceral presumption about people like you.
It's not a battle of ideas. It's a battle of identities, and the right to have an identity that's whatever it is, and that is hard, and that's something we need to try and equip people for, and to think about. This is not so much coming from an entirely rational. Here's a set of ideas. Here's the Christian idea, and you just need to snuff out this idea over here with your Christian idea, because your Christian idea is better. That it is true that that's the case, but the person who holds the view, whether they are sort of practicing one of these things you think is wrong or not, it's bound up in their whole sense of who they are, or who they think people are, or what they think about human beings. And so you've got to go so much further back and kind of navigate your way from the beginning forward again, really, rather than just saying, I think this is wrong and this is why, because the Bible says. You may have to say that sometimes because that's the right thing to say, but it's I'm now defeating my argument that any Christian will use spirit can navigate it. But so you do need to think through it, but still you got to be brave and kind.
Brave and kind, I think, is a good way of putting the two together. I think there's a lot. I like your final comment that you're not sure actually if people are navigating their way through it. A lot of people are just silent on it because it's no one wants to be the bad guy, and there is a lot of pressure to conform. But it's interesting. You also use the language of come out with the guys in secondary school. It is that kind of ostracization that others have found in the past for coming out for sexuality and other identity type stuff, and some still do. So how do we navigate as Christians the recognition now that our young people might be feeling that pressure of conforming and hiding their identity? How do we let that help us navigate how we treat those who are feeling that's what the church does? So
how helpful is it to frame it as an identity, though? Because don't you then you're getting on the train?
Yeah.
We're just using. It's finding that nuance.
Identity is not a word found in the Bible.
Come out?
Not in terms of how we'd understand it today. Like
cultural parlance. I don't know. I follow Jesus is quite an identity statement, isn't it? But I think navigating that with people in a way that says what we believe, but recognizing they're still human and we love them. And I think that's something that going back to the whole COVID thing has shown that we can't do that on social media very well, particularly, and the church can't even do that for their own disagreements, let alone for ones where it involves someone with a totally different worldview saying this is who I am, and we have to say actually we don't recognize that in love. Like we can't even say that someone being unvaccinated or vaccinated disagreeing in love. How are we going to navigate stuff that's actually like for someone who's secular, they're the very core of their being that they are presenting to you, and you're not recognizing that I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is we just don't seem very loving amongst ourselves these days. So how do we love when we're telling someone else their worldview is wrong?
Especially we're meant to be known for our love.
Yeah, it's brutal, isn't it? Yeah, they will know you by how you scream at each other on Facebook.
Yeah, I mean, particularly the homosexual and transgender is actually much easier to navigate, surprisingly, because I think there's more cultural connection points and there's more allies for discussing it. But particularly homosexuality, in terms of my media work, it's like the worst topic. It's the kind of heart sink. Oh, I've got to do this again, because it's not a topic with all the cultural assumptions you can do in a 5-minute interview usefully. You can be faithful to Scripture and faithful to God and say something, but you can't really have a useful conversation. So I try and really avoid it, because I think it's a much more joined up, longer discussion. You can't say, well, I love you, but I think you're wrong, in a little soundbite, because what does that even mean? You need much longer relational situation, or someone who's listening to you preaching or coming into your church and hearing about grace and hearing you say that Christ accepts everyone, and seeing you talk to them as though you care about them, even if they may have different things that they're doing in their lives that they know you're not happy with, but you can't experience that in a kind of soundbite conversation. They need to experience that kind of face to face with you and over a longer period to even build a relationship where they'll even listen to some thoughts about it.
Yeah, so earning the right to talk. Or to trust.
Yeah. I'm just aware of the time now, Graham. We've kept you for as long as we said we were, and it's getting on. Is there anything else? One thing we usually do is just ask guests about if there's any book recommendations. I mean, you've talked about Affinity as well, which I'm sure we'll put a link in for as well. We usually ask people for a couple of book recommendations, or maybe just if someone who hasn't written a book, but someone we should know about as a Christian but don't, and maybe try and listen to their podcast or listen to a sermon or something like that. Is there anyone?
I've already recommended the books I've recommended. I do recommend this book, Plugged In, which I don't know where I've got to, but I finished it actually. I finished it the other day. There's one chapter I haven't read, which is, I'm just going to tell you this because it's fun. The Japanese Domestic Toilet. That is the title. Because he at the end is kind of an appendix. He kind of goes through some cultural references. So he talks about bird watching, zombie movies, and the Japanese toilet as a kind of worked example of how you make connections with culture, and you inhabit it. You kind of work out where it's coming from, who's writing, where they're coming from, or what cultural assumptions are there, what's good in it, what's not so good in it. The zombie one was quite interesting, if I could bore you for a few seconds, but
go on.
Because there's a zombie series on Netflix at the moment, which some of my kids are watching, and I'd never thought about it. So I do quite like kind of deconstructing stuff, and the idea that in zombies you're sort of parodying what basically human existence is like, because it's almost can be quite zombie-like and machine-like. So there's that kind of stream of the genre. There's the idea of surviving a sort of Holocaust type experience is also kind of in there. The sense of monotony, the kind of the removal of of moral, because zombies don't really have any moral responsibility and everything else. So it kind of made me think, wow, there's quite a lot going on with zombie movies. I just thought they were a bit annoying, because these zombies just kind of march around with weird looking eyes and just behave rather stupidly. But it was good. Emotionally, I'm sure loads of people recommend this book to you. Gentle and Lowly.
I've heard good things.
By Dane Ortland. So every now and then I read one of those in the morning. So I'm just got to there in it.
Is it a devotional? Is that what it is? What is it?
No, it's not really a devotional, but it's well, you could call it a devotional. The chapters are like 2 or 3 pages, right. And it takes some sort of aspect of basically Jesus, but from a point of view of of a sort of really encouraging attribute of Jesus that will give you joy and make you more sort of encouraged to approach him. You know, Jesus is joy in you, and it's very much in the kind of style of some sort of Puritan writings, and I think Thomas Goodwin, he kind of tries to sort of replicate. So, you know, here's a chapter: he can deal gently. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward. So he kind of encourages you about how gently Jesus deals with you. Look to Christ; he deals gently with you. It's the only way he knows how to be. So
unless you're a Pharisee, it can be pretty brutal.
Well, yes, indeed. And I've thought about that recently to do with Pharisees and different approaches.
Sorry, I just had to wreck that moment.
An infinite journey. We're just doing as staff at church at the moment, which is basically a really slightly engineering way of thinking about sanctification, how you become more like Christ. Right. And although it's a bit engineering-y, it kind of makes you think about how knowledge, which is both factual and experiential, and how you exercise faith, and even simple things like making you think, what do you believe as a Christian? You believe stuff that happened in the past, you believe stuff in the present, like God's there, and you believe things will happen in the future. And you know, I've been a Christian quite a long time, and just saying it out in that way made me think. It gave me some sort of categories to think, oh yeah, there's stuff in the past. I mean, I know this, but it was just give me a vocabulary to think, where are the areas in which you're constantly exercising faith? You know, of course, primarily it's in Jesus, and it's in Jesus' work on the cross, but it's based in some, you know, historical things. It's present realities. God exists, devil exists. You know, the whole spiritual realm exists. You're believing that right now. You know, you guys are believing that. So you're exercising faith that that's true. There's an unseen reality, and you believe that Jesus historically existed, and you believe, you know, God created the world, and that was a historical fact, and you believe there's a point in history when the kind of world will be wound up and so forth. So faith has these kind of dimensions. That's quite fun thinking about that. So yeah, that's the book I'm reading. This book, Live Not by Lies. There we are. That's another book I'm reading at the moment.
I haven't read that one. I read.
Was it Benedict?
Did he do the Benedict option? Did he do that?
He did. Yeah, he did.
I read that.
So it's a similar thing.
There's a few there.
So yeah, stuff like that. And yeah, if you do a link for affinity.org.uk, and if you want to find more about the church, it's cchh.org.uk. And if you search for Ordinary and get the right one, or if you go on the church YouTube channel, Ordinary is pinned at the top if you want to watch and listen to some of those. If you've got ideas for what I should be speaking on TV and radio about, anyone can kind of send in. If you want to pray for the media work, that it kind of grows and gets more, that would be great as well. And if Dan wants to join our church, if he ever comes again, I'll say, I don't know who you are. Have we ever met before?
We've never met before. You look strangely familiar.
Yes.
Nice.
That's probably all I want to say. I've really enjoyed chatting. I could probably go for another half an hour, but you know, everyone's had enough.
We could always get you on again another time. We'd very much enjoyed just having a conversation, and that's what we do. Dan, any further comments before we wrap up?
No, it's good. It was nice. We covered some stuff I wasn't expecting to get into the COVID stuff, and I almost feel in a way I've left a lot of that behind. So having to talk about it again, especially like vaccine parcels and stuff, is just is interesting, and getting your perspective, I think, is really helpful as a church leader. I think a lot of people are not always aware of the sort of challenges. The additional challenges that this has brought about for you, and things church leaders have to think and develop expertise in, I think, is not necessarily always appreciated as much as it should be. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, and we'd love to have you back on so we could talk about a good one, environmentalism, Christianity, ecology, and
to get some people on about
would be an interesting one to chat about.
That and we didn't even touch on assisted dying. It sounds like there's loads we could talk about, so another time. But I appreciate your time, Graham, and thanks for those recommendations as well. I'll just wrap up quickly then. So those of you that are watching live, and those of you who are watching or listening on podcast, thank you so much for your support and encouragement. We do have a list of people we're having on the show over the next couple months, about 2 a month. If you are on Patreon, you would have seen that list already. We're very grateful to those who support us financially, just cover the costs of what we do. And if you've got ideas for who we should have on the show, please do ping them through. We're trying to accommodate those, and we'll have those going into 2022. Thanks for watching, and yeah, give us some reviews. Tell us what you think of our conversation and how surprised I look at the start of every show. God bless and have a good rest of your evening. See you later.